Hello, I'm Justine Brown. Welcome back to my bookshelf. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. We've been talking about how the English Civil War played out in the nascent American colonies, otherwise known as plantations. Today we turn to Maryland, carved out of the vast Virginia territory in 1632. Maryland sprang from the failure of another New World colony, that of Avalon in Newfoundland. According to the Royal Charter, it was named, quote, in imitation of old Avalon in Somersetshire, wherein Glastonbury stands, the first fruits of Christianity in Britain, unquote. It was 1625, and Avalon was all thorns and precious few rosebuds. The winters seemed endless in, quote, this remote part of the world where I have planted myself, unquote, wrote the colony's proprietorial governor, Sir George Calvert, Lord Baltimore. There is a sad face of winter upon all this land, he added. Cultivation was a struggle, and the colonists now risked mass starvation. Disease was rampant, and there were attacks on their fishing fleet by the French. These calamities prompted Sir George to gaze southwards, imagining, quote, some other warmer climate in this new world, unquote, where he could raise tobacco. And there were sectarian tensions as well. Avalon had been conceived as a refuge for English Catholics, a place where they could practice their faith openly alongside a certain number of Protestants. Some of the latter complained to King James. Sir George wrote to the Jesuit father Andrew White, who in turn contacted potential investors to arouse interest in creating a new colony down south in the Virginia territory. Each planter would receive 2,000 acres in a, quote, paradisical land of majestic forests and fruitful soil, unquote. There was an entrepreneurial dimension to these colonies, of course. In his poem, The Ocean to Cynthia, Sir Walter Raleigh writes of, quote, seeking new worlds for gold, for praise, for glory, unquote. But colonies, utopian or otherwise, also functioned as elite laboratories, allowing government to trial new policy at a safe distance. Lord Baltimore's dream was endorsed by Charles I because it might solve the tricky political problem of English Catholics, known as recusants, for their refusal to attend state religious Anglican services. Charles awarded Sir George Calvert more personal power than any other such governor. But as the English Civil War gradually deprived the king of sovereignty, his political projects, like Maryland, were targeted. The story of colonial Maryland is indivisible from Calvert family fortunes. The Calverts were precisely the sort of English Catholics that Charles's queen, the French Princess Henrietta Maria, had sworn to protect when, in 1624, she agreed to marry him. Pope Urban VIII inducted Henrietta Maria into the Order of the Golden Rose as part of her mission to defend the rights of English Catholics. The dissident minority were forced to hide their priests, who were trained at the English College in Douai, France, and smuggled into England to tend the flock there. This minority practiced in secret, as the Mass was forbidden. Sir George Calvert hailed from North Yorkshire where, as one government agent put it, quote, all the gentlemen are evil in religion there, unquote. Sir George's father, Leonard Calvert, was subject to repeated harassment for recusancy. An ambitious young gentleman, Sir George conformed to Anglicanism during his Oxford years. In order to attend university or become an MP, he had to take the oath of supremacy, acknowledging the monarch as supreme governor of the Church of England and implicitly rejecting papal authority. Sir Thomas More's refusal to take this oath, purpose-built by Henry VIII, had resulted in his execution for treason in 1535, and there had been many such casualties since. Sir George Calvert fell in with England's spymaster, Sir Robert Cecil, on a European sojourn. Returning to England on a mission for Cecil, he entered government service on a more permanent basis, and thereafter he rose quickly through the ranks. Sir George actually named his first son, Cecilius, after the man whose role it was to enforce penal laws on Catholics, such as his own parents. Sir Robert Cecil also engineered the succession when Elizabeth died in 1603. Through this connection, Sir George became one of James I's most devoted servants, achieving the rank of Secretary of State. He worked setting policy in Ireland, much of it distinctly anti-Catholic, and was rewarded with an estate there. So trusted was he that he was involved in efforts to find a wife for Charles, then Prince of Wales. Calvert's first choice for the prince was ambitious. Anna, Infanta of Spain. Sir George accompanied Charles together with King James's glamorous favorite, the Duke of Buckingham, on their notorious incognito expedition to Madrid to woo her. Passing through Paris en route, they enjoyed a masque performed by members of the French court. King James, having married his daughter Elizabeth to a German Protestant prince, had decided to select a Catholic alliance for Charles for the sake of balance. However, the Infanta had her heart set on a Catholic husband. She insisted that Charles convert, which is impossible, especially given the growing strength of the Puritan faction in the English Parliament. James would have to select a Catholic princess willing to wed a Protestant. That turned out to be the 15-year-old French princess, Henrietta Maria, with certain provisos. The princess would be permitted priests in the chapel and would play an intercessory role for English Catholics. It turned out that Charles had already glimpsed Henrietta Maria in Paris, where she had appeared in the masque. The two were now furnished with portrait miniatures to gaze upon and professed themselves in love, though of course they had yet to meet properly. They were married by proxy, so that when Henrietta Maria arrived in London by barge, dressed all in green to suggest a sea nymph, she was already Queen Consort of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Her new subjects called her Queen Mary. Charles did not convert on that continental expedition through France and Spain, but Sir George Calvert did. In 1624, he astonished many by announcing his embrace of the old religion. This, as he was perfectly aware, meant that he had to resign his post and his place on the Privy Council. Neither the ailing King James nor Charles, who became king in 1625, was inclined to push him further. Instead, Charles rewarded Sir George for his years of devoted service by making him Lord Baltimore after the town in County Longford, Ireland, which formed part of his estates. Baltimore, who had a long-held financial interest in the New World, now conceived of a colony, a plantation, which would be a refuge for English Catholics. It would not exclude Protestants, but the hotter kind of Protestant, as they were called, the Puritans, might be expected to exclude themselves. Puritans, by definition, would not stand for Catholicism. They were characterized by their horror of vestigial papistry in the Anglican Church. Like Catholics, they were religious dissidents on the margins of the Anglican mainstream. In that sense, the Mayflower Pilgrims actually had much in common with Lord Baltimore's settlers. They would be mirror worlds. To recognize this, however, would make a nonsense of Puritanism as such. The godly, as they termed themselves, to them, religious liberty entailed freedom from Catholicism. So determined were they, so disgusted by what they saw as corruption, that they crossed the Atlantic and endured harsh conditions to escape from it. Lord Baltimore secured the fresh charter for a colony, upriver from Jamestown, to be named Terra Mariae, Maryland, in honor of Queen Henrietta Maria. The name Maryland was a touchstone for the colonists. Increasingly, it became a red rag to the Puritans. Because she took her role as intercessor so seriously, Henrietta Maria became the Puritans' bête noire long before the English Civil War ignited, and the Queen dubbed herself she Generalissima of the Royalist forces. Charles, now blissfully married after a rocky start, was eager to run the Maryland experiment. He gave the 1632 charter a special character. Lord Baltimore got the most complete civil and jurisdictional authority ever derived from the English crown. In order to make a province which would be English and yet Catholic, Charles had to be a bit hands-off to appease the increasingly powerful Puritan faction in Parliament, and yet the colony would rely on its continued existence, on his patronage. Maryland was to be a palatinate, which meant that the proprietor had the right to wage war and collect taxes. Settlers would take an oath to him. As vice-regent, he would be able to create manors and titles. He could make a new world aristocracy. Lords of the manor, as they would be called, could buy 6,000 acres from the lord proprietor and receive special privileges and duties. The lord proprietor received rights to, quote, fish, whales, sturgeons, and all other royal fishes, unquote. Crucially, he received the right to build Catholic churches, chapels, and oratories. This is something that only Queen Henrietta Maria herself had been permitted to do in England, apart from ambassadors, and she was limited to one chapel for her personal use, the one designed by Inigo Jones. The fee for this lavish charter was 1/5 of all gold and silver found, and the delivery of 2 Indian arrows to Windsor Castle at Easter each year. Lord Baltimore saw Charles sign the charter in 1632, but died before it passed the Great Seal. His heir, however, Cecilius, happily took up the mantle of proprietor of Maryland. He remained in England to administer the family estates. There was much to attend to. For example, the town of Baltimore had just been sacked by Barbary pirates, with 107 inhabitants sold into slavery in North Africa. Cecilius deputized his brother Leonard to serve as governor of Maryland. The 2 great ships, the Ark and the Dove, departed for America the same year on the feast day of St. Clement, patron saint of mariners. The company consisted of 20 gentlemen adventurers, of whom 19 were Catholic, along with 250 or so artisans and workers, including some women. There were many Protestants, and some of whom later converted. Baltimore banned religious controversy on the voyage, so that nothing would ruin the harmony on the ships. After 2 months at sea, they reached the Virginia territory. Passing Jamestown, they then sailed further up the river to their designated area. The Ark and the Dove landed at an island, calling it St. Clement's, on March 24, 1634. The planters erected a large cross. Jesuit Father Andrew White became the first Catholic priest to celebrate Mass in what became the 13 colonies. The colony would average 4 Jesuit priests in the years to come. The party were well received by the local native tribe, the Yaucomico, and purchased a large tract from the chief. Father White also prepared a grammar and a catechism in the Yaucomico language. Famously, Father White converted the chief in 1640, baptizing him Charles, presumably in honor of the English king. Father White's tract, a relation of the successful beginnings of Lord Baltimore's plantation in Maryland, served to draw more settlers. The qualities that defined Maryland, a vision of religious liberty that included Catholicism, together with its links to Charles and Henrietta Maria, also exposed it to attack. Back in the old country, tensions between the king and Parliament continued to build, and this had consequences in the English colonies. The settlements were designed in part to relieve conflict at home. England had been radically destabilized over the previous century or so. Henry VIII had opened a Pandora's box when he disturbed the balance between church and state. He had made an effort to strengthen and enrich the monarchy. In doing so, paradoxically, he had weakened it. For Henry, the Protestant Reformation was a political technology, but as sects proliferated, Reformation had become revolution. So now there was that in addition to the Catholic remnant. Clearly, the king hoped that Maryland would siphon off as many members of that dissident minority as possible. The same principle applied to Puritan New England and later the Quakers. The borders between the American colonies were designed to keep these contrasting factions separate. However, many Puritans were goaded by the very presence of Catholics in Maryland. Maryland was also a trading competitor for Virginia, and Virginians resented the loss of that portion of the territory, especially to the Calvert family. These people resented the special status conferred upon the Calverts by Charles I. In 1644, while the English Civil War raged, Parliament took more and more control over the realm at the expense of the monarchy. When Leonard Calvert traveled back to England to consult his brother, Roundheads from Virginia seized control of Maryland's capital city, St. Mary's. There followed a period known as the plundering time. Puritan raiders drove off Catholic planters, looted their homes, and burned down their churches. Across the Atlantic, the same faction had sacked the Queen's Chapel. The invaders took the Jesuits captive and sent them back to England in chains, hoping they would be punished as traitors, for priests were illegal in England. All of this flew in the face of the King's Maryland Charter, of course, but Charles was on the run and Parliament was ascendant. Father Andrew White, who had been exiled from England in 1606, was prosecuted for his presence in the realm. He escaped execution by arguing that he had been returned against his will. Meanwhile, going back to America, Leonard Calvert retook St. Mary's City. Because of the situation in England, he resolved to appoint a friendly Protestant as governor, and it was possible to rebuild. In 1649, Maryland passed the Act Concerning Toleration, stating that all Trinitarian Christians could practice freely there. The first such act of its kind, it would later be studied and emulated by Charles II and his brother James II, both of whom tried to introduce religious toleration policies. Then, in the following year, Virginia purified itself of Puritans, driving them into Maryland, and the act was overturned for a time. The same thing happened in 1688, when James II was dethroned in favor of William of Orange. Ultimately, the Calverts were only able to retain control of the colony by converting to Protestantism. Still, many thousands of Catholics kept their home in Maryland. The place retained something of its original identity. In 1861, James Ryder Randall alluded to Henrietta Maria when he wrote the state anthem, urging Marylanders to, quote, be the battle queen of yore. The colony had begun with a few hundred English folk who were brave enough, perhaps desperate enough, to remake England in a new world. In this, they mirrored the Mayflower Pilgrims. Unlike the New Englanders, however, their project was to recapture something that they had heard of but never known in their lifetimes, an England of the old ways, the old religion. Virginians were famously nostalgic for the old country, but Marylanders' nostalgia had a second dimension. They yearned for a realm whose traditions had been passed down in secret. Because Charles I sought to solve certain problems in governments, their refuge received the royal imprimatur. More than anything, the king wanted to run an experiment at a safe distance from the British Isles. So the 13 colonies constituted a patchwork of experiments run as much by the English government as by the settlers. The Stuarts' efforts to sort out sectarian strife meant that, contrary to popular belief, English Catholicism was woven into the fabric of colonial America, along with more familiar threads. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Please do comment, like, and share. And I'm attaching a link to my annotated bibliography on the Jacobites in the description.